What if the signs were always there and simply no one noticed? Today, we are opening a door into one of the darkest, most unsettling corners of human psychology. We're going to investigate the true origins of serial offenders, tracing the timeline of violence all the way back to its very beginning. It's an investigation that requires us to look past the sensationalized headlines of the crimes themselves and instead peer into the quiet, formative years of the people who actually commit them.
Because you have to wonder, what if the making of a serial killer doesn't begin with their first terrifying act of violence? What if it starts years earlier, in a quiet home, a regular classroom, or even a neighborhood playground? As criminologists, this is perhaps the most disturbing, yet absolutely critical question we can ask. Can a serial killer actually be identified in childhood? It's an incredibly uncomfortable thought, isn't it? The idea that the capacity for extreme, unthinkable violence could be gestating right in front of us. Now, the answer to that question isn't simple. Let me be perfectly clear right from the start. There is no single trait, no magic universal checklist that guarantees a child will become a violent offender. But as we look closely at decades of behavioral science, forensic psychology, and extensive case studies, something highly unsettling begins to emerge. Patterns exist, and once you know exactly how to read these patterns, the timeline of a killer becomes chillingly clear. But before we look at the specific warning signs, we really have to establish a foundational truth in criminology. Not every troubled child becomes a serial killer. Far from it. However, nearly every documented serial killer shares a distinct cluster of early life risk factors. We categorize these into the three pillars of risk. First, biological predispositions, literally the hardwiring of the brain. Second, environmental influences, what the child actually experiences growing up. And third, behavioral manifestations, how they begin to act out. It's the dangerous intersection of these three elements, not just one in isolation, that creates the foundation for extreme risk. To understand how we identify this risk, we actually have to look back to the 1960s, when psychiatrist J.M. MacDonald proposed a now famous theory. You might have heard of it. It's known as the MacDonald triad. It consists of three highly specific childhood behaviors. First, animal cruelty. This is arguably the most significant indicator, as it reflects a profound lack of empathy and a chilling desensitization to suffering. Second, fire setting, which often represents a deep desire for power, control, and a fascination with destruction. And third, persistent bedwetting beyond an appropriate developmental age. While less directly linked to violence, this often indicates severe underlying psychological distress or profound trauma. For a very long time, the MacDonald triad was viewed almost as a definitive checklist for future killers. But let's pivot to what modern criminology actually tells us today. Today, behavioral science doesn't treat this triad as a crystal ball. A child fascinated by fire isn't inherently destined for murder. Instead, modern experts view these behaviors as massive red flags. They're pieces of a much larger, much more complex puzzle. They tell us that something is deeply wrong, but they don't necessarily dictate exactly what the final outcome is going to be. A much more reliable framework comes from studying psychopathy in youth. In these cases, we see a distinct lack of empathy or remorse. We see a superficial charm that's specifically used to disarm adults, along with manipulative behavior, chronic lying, and callous unemotional traits. But what makes this incredibly disturbing is how these children react to discipline. They don't respond to punishment in typical ways. Instead of learning from the consequences and actually feeling remorse, they simply refine their behavior. They become more deceptive. This isn't just a simple case of bad behavior. It's a fundamental structural difference in emotional processing. Now, we absolutely must address the environment. A striking, overwhelming number of serial killers share hidden histories of severe childhood trauma. We're talking physical abuse, emotional neglect, sexual abuse, or chronic daily exposure to violence. Trauma alone does not create a killer, but when you take severe childhood trauma and violently collide it with those biological vulnerabilities we mentioned earlier, it drastically distorts their emotional development. This is the dark intersection. This is exactly where the seeds of extreme violence take root. This tragic collision of trauma and biology often results in a condition that criminologists and psychologists call affective detachment. Imagine a child repeatedly exposed to violence. Over time, they may begin to normalize suffering as just a basic fact of life. A profoundly neglected child might completely fail to ever develop the capacity for emotional attachment. They essentially detach from the human experience. They survive their horrific environment by simply turning off their ability to feel for others. And as they detach from the external world, they retreat into an internal one.
This brings us to one of the most critical, yet frequently overlooked factors in the making of a serial offender: fantasy development. Future offenders frequently develop highly violent fantasies, control-based daydreams, and deep, dark obsessions with dominance and power. Over time, as the individual withdraws further and further from society, these fantasies become incredibly detailed. They become entirely immersive.
But here's what makes this inner world so incredibly dangerous. These fantasies, they aren't just random thoughts. They are rehearsals. The individual is mentally practicing the act of control and violence over and over again in their mind. This immersive internal world almost always precedes real-world behavior. The violence always happens in the mind long before it ever happens in reality.
As the fantasy life grows, their real-world connections wither away. Many serial offenders exhibit profound social isolation and severe alienation. We see extreme social withdrawal, an absolute inability to form genuine, reciprocal relationships, and growing feelings of superiority, or conversely, deep resentment toward a society they feel fundamentally rejected by. This isolation acts as a dark echo chamber, reinforcing their violent fantasies and further eroding whatever empathy they had left. Eventually, a terrifying psychological threshold is crossed. The individual begins to view other human beings not as people, but merely as objects, things to be used, controlled, or destroyed. When we map this onto a timeline, we see a terrifying escalation as the child enters adolescence. The early years, around ages 5 to 10, are often marked by that initial fantasy development we talked about. Moving into ages 11 to 14, the severe social isolation really takes hold. And by ages 15 to 18, the fantasies begin to bleed out into reality. The warning signs intensify into escalating aggression, voyeurism, stalking behaviors, theft purely for the thrill of it, and a morbid, consuming fascination with death. At this stage, intervention becomes significantly more difficult because the behavioral patterns are no longer just forming, they are solidifying.
We really need to pause here to analytically address the challenge of early identification. You might be asking, why didn't anyone stop them? The biggest challenge is that many of these exact traits exist in completely non-violent individuals. A child may experience horrific trauma, but go on to develop immense, beautiful resilience. Another child may be aggressive, but completely lacks psychopathic traits. Criminology, you see, doesn't deal in absolute certainties. It deals in probabilities. We are looking at elevated risks, not guaranteed outcomes. And precisely because we're dealing with probabilities, early intervention is the single most critical factor in prevention. Through rigorous psychological assessment, building strong family support systems, targeted behavioral therapy, and closely monitoring high-risk behaviors, the trajectory can absolutely be altered. When these highly complex issues are addressed early and methodically, many at-risk children do not progress into violent offenders. The risk is high, yes, but risk is not destiny. So can a serial killer be identified in childhood? Not with absolute certainty, but the signs, when viewed collectively, reveal a clear, undeniable map of elevated risk. As criminologists, our ultimate goal isn't just prediction, it is prevention. Because the chilling, unavoidable truth of the matter is this: behind every serial killer, there was once a child.
And somewhere along the way, something went terribly, horribly wrong. The shadows began to form long before the violence ever did. Comment your thoughts on this video. Also, subscribe to us to see more videos like this in the future. See you in the next video.